Hey gamers, it's G from the corner, and that's right, I have given in, I've sold out. We're finally talking about Switch 2 rumors. This has been the talk of the town everywhere. I literally cannot go on YouTube for more than like 2 days without seeing goddamn RGT85 or Spawn Wave or somebody be like, yo guys, Switch 2, did you hear about this with Switch 2? Well, guess what? We're throwing our hat into the ring. I was gonna wait till next year. I was really gonna wait until next year, but I'm sick of waiting. I want the views, I want the clicks. We're gonna talk about Switch 2, and I got the most toxic thing that I could possibly add to this conversation. Let's talk about backwards compatibility. So, backwards compatibility. It's been a thing on many game consoles, many Nintendo consoles at this point. It's, a pretty big deal. Basically, you can play your old games on the new system. It's been a thing, I want to say, man, I can't even think of the first time. The first Nintendo system, I know for a fact, to have this would be the Game Boy Color. You could play Game Boy games on it, and then going forward, Game Boy Advance could play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, DS could play Game Boy Advance games, Wii could play so on and so forth. Every Nintendo system, actually, I think since the turn of the century, has had backwards compatibility on it, except for the Switch, which, obviously that was going to be hard to do. For instance, you can't shove discs into that thing. It's not going to fit, so there was no way they were ever getting Wii U games on there. Plus, obviously, the gamepad would have required a whole new system to figure out how to get that working. And then 3DS games, why would you port 3DS games there? Why would you have that as an option? So there wasn't any backwards compatibility with the Switch. But based on all the rumblings, based on what we've been hearing from, I'm going to say trusted people. I trust most of the people who have been saying things about Switch 2, like, oh, it's happening next year, talk about it at Gamescom, all that stuff. First of all, it sounds like it is a Switch 2. It's going to be the Switch, but again, so, the question becomes, is there backwards compatibility? Well, obviously, if all these people are digging in, trying to find out everything about it, that's one of the things they've been looking into. And based on what I've heard, it's been a lot of, up and down, a lot of I'm not so sure, stuff like, Nintendo might do it, they're looking into it, but then people who are knowledgeable about hardware being like, oh, well, they'd have to jam the entire Switch 1 infrastructure into Switch 2, and then other people being like, well, they've actually done that with almost every console where, yes, if there's backwards compatibility, they just put all the memory from the old console into the new console by default. So it should be like a simple answer right there. they did it all the times before, they'll probably do the same thing again, but there was one comment that I read a while ago that really kind of got the gears turning. It was, I forget who, I don't think the company was named, but according to people, some third-party company or companies were concerned about the possibility of backwards compatibility, since it could potentially squander the sales of re-releases and such and such. Yeah, that sucks. It's a stupid thing to say. Consumer-wise, shut up. That's what I want to say, obviously, that, but you gotta really sit down and think about it. Does this really matter? In the past, usually what will happen is if a system doesn't have backwards compatibility, for instance, PS4 could not play PS3 games natively, they would try and re-release games that had already come out on the PS3. For instance, Last of Us. Last of Us is a video game. They ported it to the PS4 literally the next year. It's remastered. It looks a little better. Granted, this hasn't stopped developers because a lot of PS5 games I've seen where they'll try and port over the PS4. Remember Last of Us Part 1? Last of Us Part 1. They literally said Last of Us was on PS4, you could play it on PS5, we literally gave it to you for free if you paid for online, but we're charging $90 for it. And now apparently they're doing the same thing to 2, which you could already play on PS5, it came out the same year as PS5. So clearly, a lack of backwards compatibility doesn't stop developers from doing crappy crap like this. But will Nintendo include backwards compatibility, or will they be scummy about it? Now here's the thing. If you've been following the games industry, you'll know that usually what ends up happening is when one of the big three is on the top or is doing very well, they tend to get a little greedy. They tend to think that, oh, the consumer will buy anything, we could do whatever we want. Going into the PS3, Sony obviously made some missteps. Going into the Wii U, Nintendo made some missteps, all based on their prior success, thinking that practically no matter what they did, they would still have the exact same audience that they did before. They realized that wasn't the case and tried to fix things in spades. Sony tried towards the end of the PS3's life, started PS4 to try and turn things around, and Nintendo with the Switch massively turned things around. But there's one thing about the Switch that's really interesting. See, because of that lack of backwards compatibility, they were able to get away with porting so many Wii U games over to Switch at full price, no less, in the first few years of the system's lifespan. So, like, think about it. Next year, Nintendo drops new system at the end of the year. We go into 2025. What if they only have like 5 games out for the system all year? You know, like in 2018 when they only really had 5 or so new Switch games. Well, it'd be really great if they could just pad out that lineup with re-released Switch games, but oh, it's not going to look as good. They're going to charge full price for upscales. Now, granted, see, with Last of Us, that was like, they were still hyping it up as a remake, and I'm sure they'll do the same crap when Last of Us 2 comes around. They'll be like, oh, you know, the hardware better, we're gonna really remaster this game. It's not gonna be like playing Last of Us 2 on PS5. But Nintendo never did that with any of the Wii U ports. They were pretty much just, you know, straight, well, ports, because the system was of similar specs. Now, granted, the idea is that we're actually getting a pretty significant hardware jump, supposedly on the level of PS4, maybe even PS4 Pro, which, that sounds pretty good to me. I'm not sure really what games would truly benefit from that, or what games would be exciting to see. Another rumbling that I've been hearing is that there were Breath of the Wild on Switch 2 tech demos that were shown off that had 4K native resolution and no load times, which, as many of you know, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom both had pretty egregious load times for fast travel and such, especially compared to, you know, open world games you'll see nowadays running on systems with crazy solid state drives and whatever. But I'm not sure if this is going to really look cool enough to, like, justify a second purchase if it's real. My idea is it's just a tech demo. They're future-proofing a future Zelda game, and granted, Nintendo has turned tech demos into full releases before. Wind Waker HD actually just started out as a tech demo for testing out how a Zelda game could look in HD on Wii U, but then they said, hey, we started, let's just like do the whole thing and sell it for $60. Why not? You know, people will eat it up. And you know, obviously, it's going to be a lot tougher of a pill to swallow for Zelda fans, for Nintendo fans, if they do something like this. Like, if they just decide to charge $90 for a port of Breath of the Wild. Maybe they go the exact same route as Last of Us, where, you know, Last of Us 1 came out at the end of the PS3, and then they ported it to the next system, and then they'll do the same with Breath of the Wild. It came out at the end of the Wii U, and they ported it to the Switch too, right? Maybe they port Tears of the Kingdom later down the road. Do they have backwards compatibility, and does it affect this? I don't know. But, you know, there's another thing that is mentioned here that I have thought of once or twice before. If you put backwards compatibility in, how much does that, like, take away from people wanting to buy those new games? Now, this is something we never get numbers on. I feel like we never see numbers on, like, how many people actually use backwards compatibility on friggin' Xbox, which lets you play like 4 generations of Xbox on one system. Crazy lunatic people. But, you know, you wonder if, okay, so Switch comes out, right? And there's like 9 games on it. You have like Zelda, 1-2 Switch, Bomberman, and a few indie games on the eShop, right? So you are obviously tempted to try all of those games because you just bought the new system and you want to play those games. Meanwhile, if it had backwards compatibility with the Wii U, let's just say, you could just play all the Wii U games you missed. Or ones that you just, even if you had the Wii U, you could just be like, I'm going to buy another Wii U game. I'm going to buy an old game. I'm going to buy an old game that, you know, they've made their money from it. It makes it less worth it producing new titles for them. So, you know, and that's not even that, right? You know, it's all about that competition with themselves. I remember when the Pikmin 1 and 2 ports were coming out on Switch, I was like, whoa, you know, this and Metroid Prime Remastered is crazy because, like, okay, they just dropped 2, granted old, but there's still 2 Pikmin games on Switch right before 4 came out. You would expect that to be something they would want to save as to not cannibalize the sales of Pikmin 4. You know, it's kind of crazy that something like that happened in the first place. And what I thought was that meant Nintendo no longer cared about, like, oh, if we're going to release an old thing and a new thing's coming out, well, we got to market the old thing and then give it time and space away from the new thing. No, they don't really care anymore. They'll just toss out all their legacy content whenever. So, you know, seeing that made me think backwards compatibility was a no-brainer. But then, I mean, look at the last Direct. The last Direct was like, the big announcements were old games. They ended on a Thousand Year Door remaster. All other announcements were like a Mario vs. Donkey Kong remake and Dark Moon HD. That was already announced, but, like, you know, that was, I forget the other one. There was definitely another remake in there. Another code, like all remake stuff, you know? And it's like they clearly still care about that prior library. And I wonder truly if they're gonna stop Switch game releases. Because, okay, here's the thing. I feel like if they're really not going to do backwards compatibility, there needs to be a hard cutoff right? Like, the final Switch game needs to come out like June at the latest, and then they need to go like 3 months of nothing, because they can't do shit where they're like, oh hey, let's drop a new game on the Switch, and then the Switch 2 is out like less than 2 or 3 months later. They can't do that, because then that confuses the consumer base. Like, what are you trying to say? If they don't have a Switch and they want to play this game, they gotta buy a Switch because Switch 2 won't play those games. They're gonna have to do that hard cutoff. And then by that logic, every game we saw in this Direct, that's it. That's the end of the Switch's life cycle. But I feel like there's still a few more games in them. I'm still expecting a February Direct early next year with maybe 1 or 2 more smaller titles, remakes and such, and then we get into Switch 2 stuff by like late spring, early summer. But I don't know. I don't know, honestly. They could, again, if they keep the Switch train chugging as long as they possibly can, then they're gonna have to make it backwards compatible, because it's like, okay, why would you're not gonna sell a new game a month before your new system comes out, and therefore force people to buy 2 systems. It's not gonna work. People aren't gonna want to do it because one of them's not gonna be getting the support. And then there's even cross-gen, right? Are you guys gonna have some cross-gen games? You know, there's been talk about Metroid Prime 4 becoming cross-gen, because it's like, well, this new system's gonna be out soon. We haven't seen it, and it's obviously still happening. So like, where is that? But then it's like, well, will they pull a Sony and Xbox where, like, you know, for a while they'll have games that are coming out on both the current gen and the previous gen systems? I could see that happening. I could totally see a handful of Switch 2 games in the first like 2 years coming to Switch as well. You know, I think there was a comment recently from, I think it was Furukawa, who said that we're going to be getting Switch games until the end of next fiscal year, which, I mean, like, yeah, obviously they announced like 2 games coming out beyond March 2024. Of course there's going to be more, but if the comment really meant, like, you know, up until that moment exactly, like in early 2025, then that could be Switch 2 games that come to Switch, right? I'm gonna be honest, Switch games look fine. They don't look like awful or anything. It's not like they look so bad. It's like, well, how could this be running? This is unsellable nowadays. Why are we selling a game like this? You know, they look fine and playable. So I really don't see, you know, what the harm would be in porting a few of them to Switch. I could totally see like a Kirby game coming out, you know, first year, maybe a 2D platform, maybe a 3D one, whatever. It's not that big on the new tech, so they port it over to Switch as well, just to have, hey, another Kirby game to sell, you know? But then, like, do you do backwards compatibility in that situation? Are you just gonna try and appeal to both user bases, or are you going to be like, screw it, here's smart delivery, here's all that? Maybe you don't even want to do cross-gen if you're just gonna have that hard lockout. Maybe you just have Prime 4 as a cross-gen game because you promised it was gonna be on Switch 3 months after the system came out. Maybe you don't. It's really, honestly, in my mind, it literally is just about if Nintendo's feeling ballsy or not. Like, how greedy do they think they can be? How much does Mr. N think he can get away with tonight? I don't know. We'll find out pretty soon, maybe. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the possibility of backwards compatibility being a thing on Nintendo's next home console. Will it happen? Will it not? It's really, only time will tell. We probably won't hear about it until next year, but, you know, I don't want to get my hopes up just yet. I don't want to think that, oh man, all my Switch games, I'm going to be playing them on Switch 2, just like that. Nintendo's mentioned trying to keep a shared account system, you know, going throughout their future systems, and really, I think the only thing that maybe guarantees is like NSO being a thing on the next system. I could totally see them having some roundabout excuse as to why they're not doing backwards compatibility on the next system, when in reality they know it'll make them more money. But yeah, that's gonna do it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Keep yourselves cornered for more gaming coverage, more Switch 2 rumors and coverage. We're gonna talk about that quite a bit, well, not very soon, but when there is fire, I will be there. Trust me. See you guys on the next one.